Good morning.
Good morning.
I now call to order the special meeting for January the 31st, 2023. Welcome, everyone. And if you would, bow your heads with me for prayer. Our most gracious Heavenly Father, thank you for this day that you've given us to come out and do the work of the city. We thank you for each council member and the hard work that they put in to helping make decisions that is best for the citizens of Columbus. Thank you for the citizens who work diligently on volunteer boards and helping us to make the city the best that it can be. We pray that you will be with us as we make decisions and do the things that you would be pleasing in your sight. In thy name we pray. Amen. I think it's important to remember and worth saying that the veto power or right is vested in one branch of government to counsel or postpone the decisions enacted of another branch. It's not to be combative or to settle personal grudges between politicians, as sometimes we see on the national level, but to allow us the opportunity to make sure as elected officials that we are getting policy decisions right for the citizens that we serve. According to experts in the field of communications, communication is simply the act of transferring information from one place, person, or group to another. Every communication involves at least one sender, a message, and a recipient. That may sound very simple, but communication is actually very complex and a very complex subject. The transmission of the message from one sender to a recipient can be affected by a huge range of things. These include our emotions, the cultural situation, the medium used to communicate, and even our location. The complexity is why communication skills are considered and desired by employees around the world for accurate, effective, and unambiguous communication it is actually extremely hard. So I want to thank the council for their willingness to let us come back here today to discuss what I think is a very complex but a very serious subject for the community. And so with that, I would ask, we'll go straight to our policy agenda to discuss the mayor's veto of the city's council's decision to cancel the contract with Wagner Engineering. Do I have a motion?
So moved.
I have a motion and a second. Any discussion? All in favor, please raise your right hand. All opposed, same sign. Motion carries. At this time, before we begin the presentation with Wagner, I want to, since this occurred a few weeks ago, I've worked closely with our COO, looking at some of these things that we're dealing with the ARPA funds, which can be quite extensive and quite difficult. And so I was going to turn it over to him for a few comments before we have Wagner speak. Mr. Jim?
Good morning. What I wanted to talk about a little bit this morning is what was defined as phase 2 in this project. The $125,000 which we have paid 94. Phase 2, I think there's a misinterpretation that was from planning or more studies. As a matter of fact, phase 2 was to help funding assistance for the city for this project that we're looking at. And based upon at least preliminary results, it looks like, in my opinion, phase 2 has been successful. And I will tell you that if phase 2 works out the way, some of this is hard numbers already, some of it is in the works yet. But phase 2 should garner the city an additional over $8.5 million of funds. Some of that goes towards flight, but the majority of it goes towards the watershed and flooding issue. And we've looked at, I think that I wanted to make sure the council understood that phase 2 was really the efforts to consolidate and identify funding sources. Obviously, the city doesn't have the funds, even with the match from the state of Mississippi, we don't have the funds to move this much beyond the first 2 projects that they defined. I'm going to say this, Northside and Brickyard. But what I want to talk about is the point that Wagner yesterday applied for our match. Today was the deadline, they applied for it yesterday because theoretically or technically they were still employed by the city as of yesterday. So they were able to make that application. I just want the council to be aware that if you override the veto and fire Wagner, which you're certainly able to do, that you may put at risk some of these dollars that have been identified entering this process. I have no idea how the MDEQ will react if they find out that the group that made the match presentation for us for the $3.5 million or $3 million plus $450,000 from the county, when we tell them that the consultant that we used to do that is no longer employed by the city. I think there's some risk here that you need to consider in your decision. The other one is that there are some funds en route that, as a matter of fact, even Wagner can't go into detail yet because they haven't been formally announced. But if they, I just want to make everyone aware of that. I think they've been successful in what they were supposed to do, as long as the funds come through that have been identified. And that, as a matter of fact, I worry, quite frankly, that there's risk that we may forfeit some of these funds should we not go through with the project as it's planned at this point in time, and the plan that we have to put forth to the state of Mississippi. And that's really my point this morning, is I just want you to be aware of that, because this is important. All of this is important, but if the council decides they want to go a different direction with the ARPA funds, then all of this is a moot point. But I leave it up to your judgment, but I just want you to be aware of the types of funds and money that we're talking about for the city.
And then at that point, we have to re-advertise everything again?
Yeah, we would have to, if we were going to continue with the watershed flooding program, we would have to almost completely restart the whole process to identify a new engineering firm and to bring that up to speed. Unfortunately, at this point in time, if MDEQ rejected our application for matching money because of actions that we took, it is too late, even with a new firm, to reapply since the deadline is today.
Council, do we have any questions for Jim?
Just one, Mr. Brigham. It's a risk every time I get in my car and drive up here.
Yes.
It's a risk. It's a risk every time I get on a plane and take a flight. It's a risk. When I get up and walk, it's a risk. But we don't want to hear about risk. Okay, chances are out there. Okay, your point that you're making, I think is mute. I can't see the logic behind it. I really can't.
I thought in the council meeting that we voted to allow them to go ahead and apply for the match last Tuesday. So you saying that if we, well, not last Tuesday, but Tuesday before last. So now you're saying that if we would have, if we override this veto, then they wouldn't have been able to apply for the match. But that wouldn't have been the case, because we didn't tell them that they couldn't do the match last time. That was never in the question. So now you're saying something totally different, and then you seem to know more than what Wagner seemed to know whenever we talked to them, about the whole situation. Because none of them ever said this when I was talking to them in any meetings.
I understand, and you know what? As a matter of fact, the state of Mississippi, when they look at it, may not have any kind of negative perspective of firing Wagner at all. I'm just wanting you aware that I don't know that there's any way to predict
I don't think we fired them, though. I think we just told them that we wasn't going to use them on those new projects. We didn't fire them. We just said we wasn't moving forward on the third task order. They were already paid on the ones that they were doing. We told them to continue doing the work that they had already been paid for.
It was two words that have been used over the past few weeks. And it's all about how you frame a word. It's all about that. Two words were used that didn't sit well with me. The word came from our mayor, now it's coming from you. You used the word unaware. He used the word don't understand. The council don't understand. We perfectly understand what's going on. We know what's at stake here. We know. And we're not unaware of anything. We are very much aware of what's going on.
Well, let me say this since you invoked my name in that. If I said anything that was derogatory in my comments towards the council, I apologize for that. I have also said that part of the communication breakdown was from me as the mayor, that I should have done a better job of communicating this with the council. I'm hoping what we will do, what my prayer was, Vice Mayor Mickens, and what my statements were earlier, was that we keep this, just as a discussion point to try to make sure that everybody is perfectly clear on all this. This is complicated stuff. I'm not always perfectly clear. So again, I apologize if I insulted anybody by my statements, or if Jim did. That's certainly not our intention, and it's certainly not trying to sway a decision in one way or the other. If that's what it came across as, then I apologize again. So at this point, are there any other questions or comments? If not, we'll turn it over to Wagner for their presentation.
Mr. Jen, you said fake. You go ahead, Mr. Lee.
Now, I have a question. Looking at the agenda, and it said we're gonna meet to discuss the veto. I wasn't aware that Wagner was gonna be here to do a presentation. And the thing that I want to say to Wagner, I think you guys have done a wonderful job at explaining what you're going to do, what your intentions are. I have read information in the papers, like Councilman Mickens said. It seems like we're resistant because we don't understand your plan and what your activity is moving forward. We perfectly understand that. This is nothing personal against your engineering firm. You guys have done a wonderful job, but the job wasn't one that we agreed and could see moving forward as a council. So it's nothing personal against Wagner. It's not that we are so illiterate that we're sitting here, don't understand what we're dealing with. I just came from a conference in the MML conference. There's still millions of dollars out there. You always want to be in phase one, but there are monies out there that could be applied for. Now, a lot of time it's not what a person say, it's what you hear. What I hear this morning, oh, you missed the opportunity to get that money out there. You might not get any money, to continue this project. I have not filled out an application to apply for these funds, but it seems pretty clear cut that there were rules and guidelines to go by, and pretty much any company or engineer could apply for the map as long as we agreed to do X, Y, Z, what the money is supposed to be used for. So now, and like I say, what I hear is that, oh, Wagner did a wonderful job, and if y'all don't go along with that plan, you might cancel. That's not true. And I would prefer that information not get out there in the public.
What I heard the other night was, we haven't seen any shovels in the ground, we haven't seen any action. This is one more study. This was not a study, this was a task order, a work plan. And that was put in the paper over and over, another study. And this was actually what I understood to be a task order to actually begin the work.
So what I'm having problems understanding, grasping, are the concepts of when we are at these meetings, we ask all of these questions. When I say we ask so many questions, trying to get so many answers, I'm just gonna be so honest and upfront right now. We ask so many questions, try to get so many answers, and we don't have them. And then after these meetings, there's these private discussions where everybody sit down and they discuss what's going on, and then we come here and it's like more information has been obtained through certain people, and we're still sitting here lost in limbo land trying to figure out what's going on. Now all of a sudden today we come in here with all this information about how this is going to change phase 2 to $8.5 million. I mean, where are all these numbers coming from, because when we initially asked these questions, we don't have the answers that we need. Now, I know you, after you regroup and you go back to the drawing board and you sit down and you meet with the people that you want to meet with, and you discuss these things to try to get what you want to get to be accomplished. But as a council, so we won't violate the Open Meetings Act, because that's what all people always talk about, where are all these new things coming from? Why are everybody not aware of all this? It wasn't a study, because Tuesday at the council meeting, it was studies. Now today, they're project designs, they're this, they're that. But when we asked those questions at the council meeting, when it was just thrown on us, we didn't get those answers. So actually, what is going on with Wagner Engineering? Mr. Jim, you just basically stated that the phase that we still paid them for, we're getting more money. How?
Are you asking me where the money's coming from?
How? Yeah.
Well, right now, we have a $3 million grant from Blight that's been approved by Congress. We have a $55,000 grant for some additional planning from Congress. We have the $3.5 million match that was applied for by Wagner yesterday. And then we have at least a preliminary number from the NRCS, which is the National Conservation Resource Service.
And that's the
$2 million.
So how do we spend that $2 million?
That $2 million will be spent both in, well, actually, it'll be spent on how the NRCS tells us it's going to be spent, quite frankly, since they oversee their own
So do
project.
anybody in this room know how we can spend $2 million with NRCS?
Planning and design.
It's what?
A portion requested for is for planning and design.
To receive more money, potentially.
So is it to spend how we want, or is it just for planning and design? So we got $2 million to plan and design.
No, not to totally plan, if I'm not mistaken, not to totally plan and design, but it's based off of what NRCS says it's for. But planning and design is a portion of it.
Looking at the information that we took to them in Washington and showing them where our issues are with watershed and flooding, to be able to potentially get the level of funding that we can get from DC, we have to have that. They require it.
And the next question, we're asking about all these matches. How did these matches go about? Because when we first talked about match, from my understanding, it sounds like to me you're saying that we requested just a match based off the $3.5 million that we got. But previous discussions, they said the match has to be matched based off a project design, the project put forth. And tell me if I'm wrong, when Columbus Light and Water Department had their $1 million, they put up a plan, what was going on, and filed it to be matched with that particular project. That's how we were able to receive the money back. As of now, we have no projects identified, so how are we requesting a match? What are we matching?
Well, I believe that the application that was made yesterday identified 2 projects, and that,
The 15th.
but
and
Wagner will
the
have to
Richard.
explain
And are
that.
these approved projects? Because we haven't approved any project.
I have not seen the application.
Yeah, we
And
did.
Mr. Jim, I want to tell you, I appreciate you for answering for Wagner and everybody else. I really do. I honestly do, but you're not on the line right now.
No, I understand. You know what? The city needs to decide what your priority is. The council sets the priority. I'm the last person in the world that should
Clearly.
understand. I don't understand what the flooding issue is in the city. I haven't been here long enough to do it. I just want people to be aware of the fact that as you make these decisions, and you all know this is an important decision for the city. And I just want to make you aware of the numbers. And, you know, if we get the match, we get it. If we don't get the match. You know, I'm assuming, because I looked at the match application, that we had to identify 2 projects that add up to that $3.5 million. I don't know, because I have not seen the application.
Right.
Well, let me say this too, if I can. To Jim's comments were not in support of Wagner and against Neal Schaefer. My comments were not in support of Wagner and against Neal Schaefer. I've met with Wagner folks. I've met with Neal Schaefer folks in the last couple of weeks. I've talked to some of the council members, the ones that have called me. ones that I've called. It truly is not a one against the other, and I hate that it's come to that. That's what I was hoping this meeting, we could, I'm sorry?
Who said that? Nobody never said
Schaefer
that.
today, Neil Schaefer today, so we wasn't even discussing Neil
Well,
Schaefer.
I'm sorry, I guess I inferred that.
Like, that's what it's been made into. It's been made into a Wagner versus Neil Schaefer show, and nobody up here cares about that. Like, why did that even come about? Kevin and Neil Schaefer is the city's engineer. Wagner is a company coming on trying to spend money, help the city of Columbus spend this money. So who?
Well, I made that statement because of what you just said about, because I felt like that, y'all felt like that Wagner, that Jim was
We're not
speaking
arguing,
on.
we're just having, and
Well,
he's not.
He's not speaking on behalf of Wagner.
Nobody said that. What Jim is speaking on is basically numbers. But the numbers that he's talking about, how can he know how these numbers work and add up if he has not talked or seen someone from this engineering company? So if instead of him speaking for these people, they need to come up and spread and share their case, because the numbers are still not making sense.
Okay.
You can't magically turn something into something if you don't have a plan on how to turn it into that.
Yes,
May I speak to that?
sure.
Good morning, Council. Zach Adams, Vice President with Wagner Engineering. I really appreciate you allowing me to have the opportunity to speak. This is not intended to be a presentation of sorts. It's intended to be more of a guideline of discussion, just so we can have a chronological order of talking points. And it's also not intended to be a monologue by any means on my part, trying to convince you or present to you our case. I want it to be a dialogue, and I want to answer all the questions. We fully understand that you understand the process. That's never been in question. What we also understand is that we have had an extreme failure to communicate. When we have attempted to communicate, it's been a very poor communication. We have had ineffective communication. We own that. We understand it. We want to correct it going forward. So you're going to see that as a common theme woven through this. I hope, Councilman Beard, that also through this we'll have a better communication of what that funding looks like, how it's come to be, what it's for, how we got to those projects. So I feel confident that we'll get to that as well. We'll discuss the ARPA. We're in a little bit of uncharted waters with the ARPA, and we'll discuss that too, just openly with each other, because I don't think we have a definitive answer. And Jim mentioned correctly with NRCS that I think I know the council is in a position for a very favorable outcome as it results to NRCS, but NRCS has not made that award yet. So we cannot speak in definitive terms as it relates to that, but we'll get into that as well. So like I mentioned, this is not a presentation, it's just, I apologize. I knew this was going to be difficult to see, so we had some copies printed out. You mind if I just let you
I got a question for Wagner while he's handing that out. Like I stated before, if we did override this veto, Wagner still has been paid to go after the money. Is that not correct? And y'all would still do that.
So
Even
task
if we
order,
override this veto, y'all would still be going after the money that we paid y'all to go after, right?
task order number 2 was for the services of engaging our congressional delegations to see if there was any congressionally directed spending that could be achieved on behalf of the city. It was application for the ARPA funding, and it was also to engage NRCS for any funding that could come from that agency. That contract was for $125,000. As Jim mentioned earlier, we've invoiced for $94,000 of that, I believe. That's a lump sum contract. It's like if you get someone to paint your house, you can do it hourly or you can do it by the job. We like to engage by the job. That's the way that we like to do business, but we're obviously willing to do what is most beneficial for the council. So whenever we submit invoices based on completion of those tasks. The ARPA application had not been submitted yet, therefore we had not submitted an invoice for that particular task. The ARPA application I understand your belief that many engineering firms can do it. I don't disagree with that belief. But regardless, I think every engineering firm that engages in these applications understands that it's a time-intensive exercise, and there's a lot that goes into it. We did not understand, because it's uncharted waters from a legal perspective, of what would happen based on the outcome of this morning's meeting if we did not submit that application. We are under the understanding, and you can correct us if we don't understand the motion or the action from the Tuesday board meeting. Not only did it defer or reject task order 3, but it also terminated the contract with Wagner as a whole. That's the way that we understood that motion. And the mayor's veto allowed that, legally speaking, allowed that contract to be reinstated until it was readdressed in this meeting, which allowed us to move forward with the ARPA application. If the veto was overturned this morning and we were no longer a contracted agent of the city, we did not know if we had legal grounds to submit the application on behalf of the city this afternoon, which was the original intention. So we made sure that it was submitted yesterday. It was submitted at 6:20 p.m. and we have received confirmation of receipt of that submittal. So we wanted to make sure that we did what was right for the city, not knowing, legally speaking, what we could do based on the outcome of this meeting if it was unfavorable for us. Now, as what Jim said, I agree with what Jim said, but again, it's speculation. The only factual thing in that is that Wagner was procured in December of 2021 as the ARPA engineer for the city of Columbus. So as a termination of that contract, to move forward with ARPA, there will need to be a reprocurement of a new engineer. So it won't be just an immediate transition. I'm not making a case one way or the other. I just want to present the facts to you. And there will be a procurement for that engineering services per ARPA guidelines.
Y'all can continue what we had paid you all to do, which was to go after the money, which I think it came up that night. So y'all would have still been doing that part. We just did not proceed with task order 3 that night. Yeah.
Is it all right if I continue?
Sure.
So like I said, this is more of a chronological, just talking points through our relationship with the city. It began November 16th of 21 at the council meeting where we discussed proposal and SOQ for the consultant engineering services related to the ARPA application. And in the December 21st, 21 meeting, Wagner was selected for that ARPA engineering service. So that began our relationship some 13 to 14 months ago. And once we were selected for that, we decided that it would be best to engage in a general services contract. And this is where there may need to be some clarification based on the board action. The general services contract is simply a vehicle to allow us to do work at your discretion in the future. That's it. There isn't a budget. There isn't a scope. There is a scope, generally speaking, as to the lanes in which this general services agreement needs to stay in, engineering services, professional engineering services, but it does not commit you to any sort of contract budget amount. It just creates that mechanism to where, as you want us to do work for you via task order, we can engage in those task orders.
I'm sorry.
No problem. So on December 28th, we presented that general services agreement to the council along with task order 1, that first mechanism to allow us to do work. And task order 1 was the needs assessment. So of the sum total of the work that we have provided for the city, this is the only study that has been done for the city, if it could be called a study, and it was a needs assessment. That needs assessment was essentially a necessary component to move to DC to attract federal funding. Because rather than having an overarching idea, you need to have a laser-focused idea of the real projects in your community and a prioritized list so they understand exactly what you're asking for from a project standpoint. So that needs assessment was for $55,700, and that allowed us to engage in doing a comprehensive study of the entire city, not just for stormwater, but for all needs. Dilapidated housing and blight was another example of those, to where we could get a comprehensive list, prioritize those problems, and not only prioritize the needs, but identify the needs in that priority list that best suited themselves for federal funding. What would be most attractive at the federal level to get some interest, federally speaking, to assist the city in funding those, because we know the outcome of that needs assessment was $48 million in needs. That's something that it's clear that the city could not accomplish on its own. It's also clear that the federal government isn't going to assist the city in total for that on the front end. So we wanted to get the momentum working to where we could have a collaborative relationship and identify those needs and then work on funding sources to achieve solutions to those needs. And that sent us to task order number 2 in February of 2022. So task order number 2, another clear item where we have failed in communication to the city, and we will do better in the future. So if this is redundant, I apologize. The redundancy is not a thought of a lack of understanding. It's to make sure that I have effectively communicated what Task Order 2 is about. So Task Order 2 is, once we understood that needs assessment from Task Order 1, once we prioritized those needs, once we understood the ones that would be most favorable in the eyes of a federal partnership, we engaged in contacting those federal partners. In Task Order 2, I want to be extremely clear. Our goal is to not represent the city in any sort of lobbying capacity. That's not what we do as an engineering firm. Our goal was to identify potential areas of funding sources, lock arms with the city, help you navigate that process, equip you with the tools for success. And the funding that was achieved out of Task Order 2, the city got that funding. Wagner didn't get it. I'd like to think that we helped equip the city with the tools for success to where our partnership with the city was important in achieving that funding, but the city is who got that funding. I just want to be extremely clear. And that was for $125,000. The fee terms in that was lump sum, just like we previously discussed. The primary scope items were the congressional delegation engagement, the federal agency engagement, and the ARPA application. And that's where you're seeing the invoices. We have not invoiced 100% yet, so we haven't technically been paid for all of those services because we had yet to submit the ARPA application, and we're not going to invoice for services that haven't been rendered yet. And that application was submitted yesterday. So the fruits of Task Order 2, what came out of that is, Jim, you mentioned the word grant. I want to be clear here that this was not a grant. This is appropriations action. So Congress appropriated through congressional directed spending 2 items for the city of Columbus. Number 1 was $3 million for dilapidated housing. That $3 million was passed in the most recent omnibus bill. It is official. You access that through HUD, through a request in Atlanta. We can help you navigate that process. It's as simple as putting a letter together and going through HUD and getting their formal application to request the funding and show what you're going to use it for. What you can use it for is just what you requested, dilapidated housing. There is not a specific project identified yet. As long as you identify projects that fall under the umbrella of the intent of the funding from Congress, you can use this $3 million for that. Timeline. That funding, after an omnibus bill passing, is usually the summer following. So you could expect this to be available June or July. That's how the wheels of government work. It's not an immediate deal. It's going to be June or July. That funding will be available. All you have to do is request it from HUD. They know it's yours. You just have to go through the process and you'll get it for dilapidated housing. In addition to that, we knew that we were going to be engaging NRCS. NRCS has an extremely specific prescribed process that you must go through to get to construction for the needs in your community. One of those is a preliminary investigation feasibility report. They call it a PIFR. And the PIFR is a required component of NRCS. It does not matter about the needs assessment that's previously been conducted. None of that matters or takes precedent in the eyes of NRCS. We have to follow their process. So we talked to our congressional delegation. They understood that. They appropriated funding in the form of $55,000 to allow the city to do that necessary component to access the NRCS funding in advance of speaking with NRCS with a request based on the letter that Mayor Gaskins wrote. We were successful in that. That was appropriated. Same timeline. Omnibus bill available this summer. And then we have the ARPA application submittal. So we were procured as a city engineer, or the ARPA engineer for the city, be clear with that. And through meetings with the council, through the needs assessment, it was identified that the 2 projects to be submitted within the ARPA were for Brickyard and Northside. Those were the 2 projects identified. Now, it is not required to have a completed design for a project to submit an ARPA application. That is not a requirement. Having a completed design for an ARPA application will get you a single point towards the value of your ARPA application. Every ARPA application that is submitted is graded based on a point value. The higher the points, the more competitive it is, the higher likelihood that it's going to be awarded for the match. That component, the design, was for 1 point. And we'll get to Task Order 3 in a moment. Task Order 3 was not for a study. It was to help the city achieve that 1 point. And we'll get very clear with that in just a moment because that was not effectively communicated. And then the NRCS potential funding. NRCS, the mayor wrote a very comprehensive letter to request from the NRCS. You can put forth to the NRCS what you would like to do with the NRCS's money, what your plan A is, what the plan that you want to put forth, what you think is best. And in the case of the city of Columbus, the plan that was put forth was, we want this ARPA application, the potential $6.9 million, to be exclusive for construction, exclusive. Therefore, some of the NRCS funding could assist in the necessary design, bidding and contracting for those projects. Obviously, you have to go through the prescribed steps with ARPA where you're looking at the PIFR, you're looking at the required planning and design process, but we wanted that initial funding from NRCS to include these projects to allow that ARPA funding to be for exclusive construction. NRCS has not awarded that funding yet. NRCS could send you that funding and say, you know, we think this is a higher and better use for this funding based on your needs, and we may have to go to Plan B. And in Plan B, ARPA is technically available to support design, bidding and contracting, and construction oversight services. It's capped at 4%, okay? Planning purposes only. I don't want to get locked into this number, but for planning purposes only, based on traditionally accepted ACEC curves, you can expect engineering costs for planning and design, bidding and contracting, construction oversight to be in the neighborhood of 15%. That can just be a number, just as a litmus test as to how much this is going to be of the total project value, okay? That varies based on the scale of the project and based on the complexity of the project. Clearly, if it's a more difficult project to design, you may see it creep up. If the scale is huge, you may see economies of scale come into play, and it may creep down a little bit. But that 15% is a good litmus test. It's not a rule, it's just a guideline. So this brings us to task order 3. One thing that we were not clear on, and it is our fault, and we completely own that, is that task order 3 was not for a study. It was not. The only study Wagner Engineering has achieved for the city was task order 1, the necessary needs assessment to put you in a position for success in Washington as it related to specific items of need for federal interest. What task order 3 was design, bidding and contracting, and construction oversight for a portion of the ARPA funding. When I say it's a portion of the ARPA funding, we're not going to initiate a task order for the full amount because we don't know if you're going to receive the match or not, and we don't want to put you in a bad position. So let's just say worst case scenario, you do not receive the match. Well, we identified a portion of Brickyard and a portion of Northside to move forward with so we could have a running start regardless of the outcome of ARPA. Once we understood what the outcome was, we could engage in construction immediately because the design would be complete. We'd have plans, we'd have specs, specifications, we'd have bidding documents, we'd be ready to advertise and award a construction contract to the lowest and best firm that would apply for that. And the second motivation for task order 3 was we knew that if a design is in place based on ARPA, that it could help you achieve an additional point on that application and potentially make it more competitive. So there were 2 factors for task order 3, none of which were a study. It was necessary design, necessary bidding and contracting, construction oversight, and then the secondary component of having an additional point that would help the competitiveness of your ARPA application. Are there any questions there? Because I know.
I knew it was a design.
Okay.
I think I made the statement that we need a design to tell us how to clean our ditches that night.
That's right.
So we knew what it was for. I can't, like I said, I can't speak for everybody else, but I was well aware of what it was for. But then you also said for construction, overseeing the project, right?
That's right.
Okay, but then on the second pages, which they're not included in here, when the cost construction, you had 20% of overseeing the project on that the other pages that you gave us when the job starts.
I'm not sure.
It was 2 other pages that we were given that night. When the job starts, it would be 20% to manage the project. Yeah, to manage the project.
Oh, construction contingency? Okay, yeah, so construction contingency is just a standard process. When we do an opinion of probable cost for a specific construction item, we're going to say that there needs to be a contingency set aside to allow for changes in the market, changes in anything that may impact the construction cost from a line item unit cost basis. That is not our cost. That would be costs that would be related to the actual construction of the project. Once we put the opinion of probable cost. What that says is, when you advertise this, this is what we reasonably expect the bids to come in at. So you can have an order of magnitude in your mind of what you should expect to engage in a construction contract with. That could come back higher or lower. In the event it comes back higher, that contingency could be exercised on the front end. Through the life cycle of a project, there could be unforeseen circumstances that we can't identify on the front end as it relates to a multitude of things on the project site actually in the field. Those could result in a change order. Contingency could be exercised. That was not a professional engineering service. That was a set aside to allow for changes in the environment as it relates to construction.
Like traffic, I think it was like $90,000. I mean, I don't have the papers in front of me, but
Traffic control.
yeah, traffic control.
Yeah, traffic control, that's part of the cost of the construction.
Yeah, but this is on a side road in North Columbus, so why would it be that high when you can just block off the whole road?
Task Force?
See, I think this stuff was just thrown to us that night.
Estimated.
Yeah.
But it may not even have to utilize that.
Right, but that's what I'm saying though. It was thrown to us within 2 hours before our meeting. So you can understand why we were upset that night and what was going on.
And I want to apologize again for that. That's not the way that we do business. That's not the way that we'll do business with the city going forward. We accept responsibility for the failure in communication as it relates to it. Traffic control as it relates to the construction of a project is on the onus of the contractor themselves that have been awarded the contract. That is purely an estimate as it relates to the OPC. It could be significantly less. But I'll tell you one thing that we want to generally avoid when we give you an opinion of probable cost is to come in low. So when you see our estimates, we're going to make sure that we err on the high side so you don't get hit with any unexpected surprises as it relates to the construction amounts. So again, on task order 3, the services for design, bidding and contracting, and construction engineering services. What construction engineering is, just to make sure, in case I haven't covered it, was when we develop those plans and specs and the bid documents and it goes out for advertisement, a contractor is awarded, there are inspectors that are engaged on that site to ensure that that contractor follows through and implements that project in accordance with the plans and specifications. And we would oversee that process to make sure that it was done. That was the third component of that. Again, it was not a study. The opinion of probable cost that the council saw that Tuesday was for just over $1 million. That was for a portion of the ARPA, like I said, to try and get a bit of a running start to where, regardless of the ARPA decision, there would be a mechanism in place to begin construction as soon as possible. Because one thing that we have to understand is that we have two parallel paths going here. We have the state component, which is the ARPA application, and then we have the federal component, which is the NRCS. The NRCS funding is going to be a longer-term initiative. We wanted to also focus on a shorter-term initiative to where we could leverage and balance those two, okay? The ARPA, once that decision is made, we can engage very quickly in it. NRCS, we expect a decision from them soon. I'm not in a position to say a specific time, but we expect it in the very near future to exactly what your funding level is going to be and what NRCS expects the usage of those funds to be by the city. And NRCS is fully aware of the request made by the city council or the city on behalf of the mayor as to what your intentions are for the use of those funds. I have no reason to believe that would change, but obviously I cannot speak on behalf of ARPA. But that is a longer term initiative to where you're looking at things from their prescribed process to where you're going in, you're looking at holistically from a watershed basis what the problems are. When we look at it holistically, the projects that we've identified in Northside and Brickyard, they are going to come out of that. That's why we got on the front end and identified them early. But NRCS, regardless of the needs assessment, they still want you to follow their prescribed process. And that's going to be a planning and design where you look at it holistically. There's 4 HUCC 12 watersheds that impact the city of Columbus. Look at them holistically, identify all the areas of mitigation interest to all the areas that could potentially impact flooding to where you could engage in an actionable construction project to prevent and mitigate those flooding activities. And then they want you to lay all of that out and pick the best ones and pick a path forward for construction. That's NRCS's process. Our request is simply for the two projects to be included in that process. And I have no reason to believe otherwise, but we cannot speak to what NRCS's decision is going to be. And you can see here, we made sure to include our proposed engineering services, that design, the bidding and contracting, the construction oversight, the $122,000 you saw, based on the opinion of probable cost, was 12%. So go back to that 15% for planning and design. This was a tick below that. So just to kind of give you that litmus test of, okay, are these costs for professional services in line with what we should expect based on the construction? I believe that the answer to task order 3 is yes. So again, with task order 3, I've covered the majority of this, so we'll just go through it quickly. It includes standard engineering design services, the design, bidding and contracting, construction oversight. The cost of the work does not depend on the ARPA grant match. Regardless of that decision, we can get started with that. Obviously, we're just a little too late for that additional point for the application since we submitted that yesterday, so that secondary motive is no longer in place. But the initial motive of getting a running start to get actual construction begun is still there. And then, so obviously I mentioned that last point for the increases of maximum grant score opportunity. So the remediation, what is the construction? What is that $1 million that we identified in task order 3? It was about just shy of 26,000 linear feet of overgrown, debris-filled, silt-in drainage conveyances and nearly 100 inlets and junction boxes that are functionally obsolete in wards 1, wards 4, and wards 5. So those are some of the critical components that we identified. It is much more complex than ditch cleaning. I really try not to use the word ditch cleaning when in relation to this. It's not getting an excavator out there and clearing things out. It's identifying undersized culverts, looking at junction boxes, looking at inlets, preparing solutions and getting them fixed. And it requires design. And there's a lot more components that could be impacted in that as it relates to utilities, grading, a number of things that would have to be addressed in the design process. So that was task order 3, just to cover it, not a study. It was for actionable engineering work to get to construction. So this is a recap. We've gone over this, so I'll do it really, really quickly. Our relationship began in December 21 when we were selected as the ARPA engineer. In February of 22, we completed the needs assessment, which really gave you a laser-focused approach for federal engagement. In June of 22, we worked with the county for matching funds. That's one thing that I failed to mention on the ARPA side. $3 million of the city is in that match. $450,000 is from Lowndes County with the assistance of the mayor in front of the Board of Supervisors, successful in getting that $450,000 match. It should be made very clear that that $450,000 is only coming from the county in the event the ARPA application is successful and it's for construction. Those are the two components that are the requirements for that $450,000. So there is not a plan in place where it's not for construction. So you can check that off. The only potential variable that can impact that is the success of the ARPA application. And then in July of 22, we initiated the task order 2 for strategic services assistant. Again, that particular task order was to help you guys navigate the process, identify opportunities, engage our congressional delegation, get you in front of NRCS, lock arms with you, give you the tools for success to where the city of Columbus could go and achieve those funds. And to date, Councilman Beard, to go through those numbers, to date, the $3 million has been appropriated through Omnibus for dilapidated housing and blight. It'll be available in the summer. The $55,000 has been appropriated for the PIFR. It'll be available in the summer. So that's a shade over $3 million. The other $3,450,000 was for the ARPA application. $3 million from the city, $450,000 from the county to make the $3,450,000 for a total project construction cost based on the current plan at $6.9 million. So we got the $3 million plus the 3.5, call it match. So now we're at $6.5 million. And then there's an anticipated favorable outcome from NRCS. The request was for $2 million. So that's the placeholder we're using there. So that gets that up to the $8+ million. There is a potential that it could be more. I'm not going to say there's a potential and there could be more without saying there's a potential there could be less. I'm not just going to talk about the positives. I think it is extremely unlikely that it's less. I think you will be in a very favorable outcome with that, but obviously I cannot speak to it. And being less is a non-zero chance, so I'm not going to sit here and tell you that it's not a possibility. December of '22, approved the ARPA grant submittal process. So we were engaged as a ARPA. You approved us to submit that specific ARPA grant on your behalf. And then yesterday, on January 30th at 6:20 p.m., we submitted that application for the full match of $3,450,000 for activities related to drainage improvements for Brickyard and for North Side. So that brings us to where we are today. And hopefully I answered some questions. I know I did the majority of the talking there. I'm certainly open for any additional questions. I just want it to be clear and on the record that from a study standpoint, there was a $55,000 needs assessment on task order 1 that was absolutely necessary. That is the only study that has been engaged in, with the exception of requirements from NRCS. There isn't another study that we've identified. Everything that we brought forward to the City Council has been to directly identify funding for solutions and to engage in professional engineering services as it relates to construction activities for these problems.
Thank you. Council, do you have any questions? Comments?
I do have a comment. Since I did a lot of the research on Wagner, I have a comment I'd like to read from the city of Ridgeland. 30-year relationship, excellent, especially in planning phase efforts, which has allowed them to be poised and first in line for federal funding when it's available. And I have others, but I thought that was pretty significant.
And we're in unprecedented times of money that's available for this type of work too. Council, any other questions, comments? Thank you, sir.
Yep, thank you.
At this time, I would ask for a motion for closed determination to enter into executive session.
So moved.
I have a motion by Councilman Beard, Green. Go down the line. Do I have a second?
Hold on for a second. What about the veto? That going into executive session, Jeff?
No, you wouldn't discuss overriding the veto in executive session. That's an open session.
Is that not why we here? Do your motion.
To executive session? Any discussion?
Again, make sure I understand. Are we going into executive session and not discuss this veto? And this is the reason the meeting was called.
Right, no, you can discuss the veto at any time. If you would like to do that now, yes, executive session is on other matters. But if you'd like to discuss the veto now, that's perfectly fine, sure.
I motion that we discuss the veto now.
All right. Any comments or questions about the veto?
No, I think you framed it. I make a motion to override the mayor veto.
We have a motion. Do I have a second?
Second.
Any discussion? All in favor, raise your right hand. All opposed, same sign. Motion carries. Veto is overridden. Thank you. Do we have a motion to go into, we had a second on executive session. Any discussion? All in favor, raise your right hands. All opposed, same sign. We are now in executive session, if we could clear.